Human history is simple. Things were terrible before 1895. Terrible.
One of the things that's really surprising to me, and that I think is absolutely reprehensible, is the fact that this is not widespread knowledge among students in the West, any of this, and it's because your education, your historical education, if you started to describe it as appalling, you would barely scratch the surface. These were the most important events of the 20th century.
The curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. The challenge of the 21st century is that we are being completely pulled apart to an unprecedented extent by all the things that we feel the need to be for so many different people, in so many different circumstances. This fragmentation is counter to our longing for wholeness and authenticity. The world is not a perfect place, and never will be. As long as there are people who go hungry or die from preventable diseases, there will always be room for improvement. There are so many ways in which 21st century globalization differs from that of the 20th century. Everyone has a role to play in helping those in need. In 20th century, technology and sciences continue to develop changing production, consumption, and the way of life. As the accumulated knowledge, gained over generations, is so readily available at one's fingertips via the internet now in 21st century, this gives new challenges for the institutions of teaching and learning. We can say that we face a complex situation where not much can be taken for granted.
The most important events of the 20th century, and they're barely covered at all in standard historical curriculum. You know of something, I would presume, about World War II and about the terrible situation in Nazi Germany and the death of 6 million gypsies and Jews and homosexuals in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. But my experience with students has been that none of them know anything about what happened as a consequence of the repression of the radical left in the 20th century.
Forget it, because you're not who you should be and you don't deserve your self-esteem. And second, what good is happiness going to do you when you're unhappy? And you will be. So there's nothing in that to get you out of bed in the morning. You need an adventure, and the greater the better. And so it's back to the high seas, gentlemen. You know, out on the rolling waves where there are new continents to conquer and new things to overcome. And if you think that all the frontiers are gone, then you're not looking, because there's frontiers everywhere, and that's where you should be, right? Working diligently to expand the domain of habitable order into the chaos of potential. And that'll force you to discover who you are and to bring that into the world. And that's the role of men in the 21st century. And there's nothing about that that's anything but good for anyone.
We can experience despair in the face of rampant materialism, consumerism, environmental devastation, violence and hate crimes, and isolation engendered by the breakdown of intimate relationships. We are flooded with cortisol, as if we are facing all types of dire threats to our survival, though they are in fact a steady stream of trivial stressors such as traffic or being late to an appointment. When large numbers of us are invisible due to homelessness or marginalization imposed by a privileged few based on race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, ability, or religion, the collective fullness and richness of the experience of shared humanity in the 21st century will elude us. In a very real sense, none of us can be fully authentic and whole while others are not. None of us are truly free unless all of us can be.
Now, the other thing that was very interesting about the Soviet, especially about the Gulag Archipelago, you see, it was released in the West in about 1973 or thereabouts. Now, the student movement of the 1960s was very much influenced by Marxist and communist doctrine. And that was especially the case in France, where the most reprehensible intellectuals of the 20th century have emerged, including all the damned postmodernists who've occupied the universities now, as far as I can tell. And what happened essentially in France was that the Marxist/communist students were attempting to foment revolution, but what happened, and that peaked in about 1968, and what happened was, at least in part as a consequence of Solzhenitsyn's revelations, the idea that the Soviet model or the Maoist model, for example, could be used as an example of the working people's utopia was completely and catastrophically, and at least in principle, finally undermined. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things, and I've told you already, I think before, that today, for example, about 250,000 people will be lifted out of abject poverty, and about 300,000 people attached to the electrical power grid. We're lifting people out of poverty collectively at a faster rate that's ever occurred in the history of humankind by a huge margin. And that's been going on unbelievably quickly since the year 2000. The UN had planned to have poverty between 2000 and 2015, and it was accomplished by 2030.
When we feel like we are only allowed or permitted to be pieces of ourselves in relationships, in workplaces, and at home, we feel claustrophobic and small, and we desire to be more of who we are, genuinely and authentically. We may never be completely whole our entire lives, but we are always moving toward that end, carried by our longing. Intimate, healthy, and loving relationships provide the light that we need to nourish emerging wholeness. When others can accept us non-judgmentally for who we are, we give ourselves permission to do the same with ourselves. We then change in ways that align with our longing. We must train the next generations to adapt to the many inevitable changes, but also to participate in giving the changes a direction towards the common good, securing the future for continuous life on our planet.
And I believe that one of the consequences of that is that this element of history has been under-examined, and certainly very little attention has been brought to it in the public school curricula, and there's absolutely no excuse for that. It was the worst thing that happened in the 20th century. And that's really saying something, because the 20th century was about as bad as it gets. And the fact that these deaths on massive scale occurred, and the fact that we don't know that deep inside our bones is a testament to the absolute rot of the education system.
The fundamental assumptions of Western civilization are valid. How about that? You think it's an accident? Oh, here's how you find out, okay? Which countries do people want to move away from? Hey, not ours. Which countries do people want to move to? Ours. Guess what? They work better. And it's not because we went around the world stealing everything we could get our hands on. It's because we got certain fundamental assumptions right. Thank God for that. After thousands and thousands of years of trying. And because of that, we've managed to establish a set of civilizations that are shining lights in the world. Now, you can be pretty damn filthy and still be a shining light in this world, right? Because if you look around the world at the state of governance in most places, it's like the most pathological, corrupt, and vicious thugs rule. And to stand out as an illuminated light against that background isn't so difficult. But nonetheless, we're as good as it's got.
We must use the potential of school and education for training the new generation to adapt to the inevitable changes, as well as being part of steering the changes towards the common good of all living creatures on our planet. Nevertheless, one might say that human beings are distinct in their potential to channel the intense anxiety of being finite into creative potential. We suffer because we long for more time, but this suffering drives us toward greatness in the time we have. It pushes us to be our very best self. If you find this content interesting, then give this video a big thumbs up and make sure to hit that subscribe button below. See you in the next video.